June 19, 1944, 10:23 a.m. Philippine Sea, 150 miles west of Guam. The radar scope aboard the USS Lexington bloomed with contacts. Not a handful, not a squadron, but a swarm that filled the screen like a plague of locusts descending on crops. Ensign Charles Brewer leaned closer to the display, his hand instinctively reaching for the intercom, though the words caught in his throat. 100 contacts, 150, 200. The numbers kept climbing, each blip representing a Japanese aircraft hurtling toward the American carrier task force at over 200 knots. In the Combat Information Center, the air grew thick with tension, and the acrid smell of electrical equipment pushed beyond normal operating temperatures. Men who had seen combat before, who had survived Coral Sea and Midway and the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign, felt something they had not experienced in 2 years: genuine uncertainty about whether they would survive the next 3 hours. Above them, on the flight deck, the catapults were already hurling F-6F Hellcats into the morning sky, one every 15 seconds, a rhythm of mechanical violence that would not cease until every available fighter was airborne. The sound was thunder without pause, compressed air and steam and radial engines merging into a continuous roar that rattled teeth and made speech impossible. And beyond the steel walls of the carrier, suspended between ocean and sky, American fighter pilots were about to participate in the most lopsided air battle in the history of naval warfare. A slaughter so complete, so devastating, that it would be remembered not as a battle, but as a hunt. They would call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The battle did not begin on June 19, 1944. It began 2 years earlier, in the scattered wreckage of Japanese naval aviation across the Pacific, in the training programs that had been gutted to feed the insatiable appetite of a war Japan could not afford to fight, in the strategic decisions that had squandered irreplaceable veteran pilots in operations that achieved nothing but delay the inevitable. By the summer of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy that had struck Pearl Harbor and rampaged across the Pacific in 1941 and early 1942 no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The carriers remained, the aircraft could still be manufactured, but the men who flew them, the graduates of the rigorous pre-war training program that had produced some of the finest naval aviators in the world, were dead. They had died over the Coral Sea, over Midway, over Guadalcanal, over Rabaul, over Truk, in hundreds of small engagements and large battles across 2 years of attrition that no amount of courage or skill could offset. Japanese naval aviation in 1944 was a hollow shell, a facade of capability concealing catastrophic weakness, and it was about to be exposed in the most brutal way imaginable. The Japanese pilot climbing into a Zero or Judy dive bomber at dawn on June 19 was not the warrior who had dominated Pacific skies in 1941. He was younger, often barely 20 years old, with perhaps 60 or 70 hours of flight training, a third of what his predecessors had received, less than a quarter of what his American opponents now completed before their first combat mission. He had practiced takeoffs and landings, had fired his guns at towed targets a few times, had absorbed lectures on tactics and combat maneuvers that he had never actually performed under instructor supervision. He knew in theory how to drop a torpedo or dive bomb a moving ship, but he had never done so against live opposition, had never felt the disorienting terror of anti-aircraft fire or the gut-wrenching panic of an enemy fighter on his tail. He was a replacement, a substitute, a body filling a cockpit because there was no one else available, sent to fight a battle he had no realistic chance of surviving, let alone winning. The strategic situation that brought these inadequately trained pilots to the Philippine Sea was the result of Japan's desperate attempt to reverse 2 years of defeat. American forces under Admiral Raymond Spruance had invaded Saipan in the Mariana Islands on June 15, 1944, threatening to cut the maritime lifeline between Japan and its conquered territories in Southeast Asia. More critically, Saipan was within B-29 bomber range of the Japanese home islands. Its loss would mean that American heavy bombers could strike Japanese cities with impunity, burning the urban centers where Japan's war production was concentrated. The Imperial Japanese Navy had no choice but to commit its remaining carrier forces to a decisive battle, to gamble everything on one throw of the dice because the alternative was slow strangulation. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa assembled 9 carriers and more than 400 aircraft for Operation Ago, the plan to destroy the American invasion fleet and annihilate its carrier support. The plan was ambitious, complex, and predicated on assumptions that had been obsolete for 18 months. Ozawa believed his carriers could strike from ranges that would keep them beyond American retaliation. Japanese aircraft had longer range than their American counterparts, a legacy of the design philosophy that had created the Zero. He believed his land-based aircraft on Guam, Rota, and Tinian would coordinate with the carrier strike, overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers. He believed that the quality of Japanese naval aviation, the warrior spirit and tactical skill that had made it legendary, would compensate for any material disadvantages. Every one of these beliefs was wrong, and the price of that wrongness would be measured in hundreds of young lives extinguished in flame and falling metal. The American Carrier Task Force that awaited Ozawa was the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, carrying more than 900 aircraft, supported by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that bristled with anti-aircraft guns. But numbers alone did not account for American superiority. The F-6F Hellcat fighters that would meet the Japanese attack had been designed specifically to counter the Zero, incorporating lessons learned from the captured Akutan Zero and 2 years of combat experience. The Hellcat was faster, especially at high altitude. It could dive away from any Japanese fighter. It was armored, capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy a Zero. Its 6 50 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. Most critically, the pilots who flew Hellcats were products of a training pipeline that had been systematically refined and expanded. They completed 300 hours of flight training before reaching the fleet, had practiced gunnery and tactics until they became instinctive, and they fought with the confidence of men who knew their equipment was superior. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, 69 fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes, was detected by American radar at 10 a.m. on June 19th, still more than 140 miles away from the Carrier Task Force. The warning gave American commanders precious time to prepare. Every available fighter was launched, forming a layered defense between the carriers and the approaching enemy. The Hellcats climbed to altitude, positioning themselves upsun where they would be difficult to spot, and waited. The Japanese pilots, flying in loose formations that indicated their inexperience, came on steadily, unaware that they were being tracked by radar, unaware that their approach vector was being communicated to every American fighter in the air, unaware that they were flying into a killing ground where every advantage belonged to the enemy. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading a division of Hellcats from Lexington, spotted the first Japanese formation at 15,000 feet, a mixed group of Zeros, Vals, and Judies that seemed almost oblivious to the danger above them. The Japanese were focused forward, scanning for the American carriers, their attention fixed on the mission objective rather than their own defense. It was a fundamental tactical error, the mistake of pilots who had been taught what to do, but not how to survive. Brewer rolled into his attack dive, his wingmen following, and the Hellcats plummeted down on the Japanese formation like hawks on sparrows. The closure rate was enormous. The diving Hellcats approaching 400 knots, the climbing Japanese aircraft barely half that speed. Brewer selected a Judy dive bomber, centered the target in his gun sight, and squeezed the trigger. All 650 caliber guns opened fire simultaneously, and the Judy disintegrated, pieces of wing and fuselage tumbling through the sky, the pilot dead before he could react. Brewer pulled up, climbed away, and looked for his next target. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Across the sky, the pattern repeated itself. American fighters dove from altitude, fired devastating bursts at close range, and pulled away before the slower Japanese aircraft could respond. The Zeros, flown by inexperienced pilots who tried to turn and dogfight as their training had taught them, found that American pilots simply refused to engage on those terms. The Hellcats used their superior speed and power to dictate the terms of combat, engaging only when they held every advantage, breaking off when the situation became unfavorable. It was not chivalrous. It was not honorable in the traditional sense. It was efficient, systematic slaughter, and within 20 minutes of first contact, more than 40 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, their wreckage falling into the Philippine Sea in expanding circles of oil and debris. Those Japanese pilots who survived the fighter gauntlet faced something even more terrifying: the layered anti-aircraft defenses of the American fleet. By 1944, American ships carried radar-directed fire control systems that could track and engage aircraft with unprecedented accuracy. The new proximity-fused shells, devices that exploded automatically when they detected a nearby aircraft, transformed anti-aircraft gunnery from an art into a science. As Japanese aircraft penetrated the outer fighter screen, they flew into a storm of steel that filled the air with shrapnel and explosion. The inexperienced pilots, already rattled by the fighter attacks, found themselves attempting to execute attack runs through gunfire so intense that it seemed impossible to survive. Many broke off their attacks prematurely, releasing bombs and torpedoes at ranges too great to be effective, desperate to escape the killing zone. Others pressed on with the courage of men who knew they were already dead, boring in through the flak until their aircraft shattered, or they completed their runs against targets that seemed untouchable. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese wave, fewer than 30 survived long enough to make attacks on American ships. Of those 30, only a handful managed to hit anything, and the damage they inflicted was superficial. Near misses that caused minor casualties, a few direct hits that failed to penetrate armored decks. 27 Japanese aircraft were shot down by fighters. 15 more fell to anti-aircraft fire. By 11:00 a.m., the first wave had been destroyed, and the radar screens were already showing the approach of the second wave, 128 aircraft, flying in the same predictable formations, heading toward the same carefully prepared defenses. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese pilots during the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not something they saw, but something they heard: the distinctive sound of American radial engines, the mechanical roar of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 that powered the F-6F Hellcat. That sound, high and angry and relentless, became the harbinger of death. Japanese pilots would hear it behind them, above them, diving down on them before they ever saw the aircraft that produced it. The sound meant that American fighters were close, that the attack was coming, that survival depended on desperate evasive maneuvers that might not be enough. Unlike the lean, high-pitched whine of the Sockeye engine in the Zero, the American engine note was deep and powerful, the voice of an industrial civilization that could afford to put 18-cylinder radial engines in its fighters, that valued pilot protection and firepower over weight savings, that approached aerial combat as an engineering problem to be solved rather than a spiritual test to be endured. Every Japanese pilot who heard that sound and lived to tell of it remembered it with visceral dread. The acoustic signature of technological superiority, of overwhelming force, of an enemy that fought with advantages so complete that courage and skill became almost irrelevant. The second wave met the same fate as the first. though the slaughter took longer simply because there were more targets. American fighter directors, coordinating from the carriers, vectored Hellcats toward the densest Japanese formations, creating multiple interception points where Japanese aircraft ran into fresh fighter divisions even after surviving earlier attacks. The Japanese pilots, many flying combat for the first time, made fundamental errors. They climbed when they should have dived, turned when they should have run, fixated on single targets instead of maintaining situational awareness. The Americans exploited every mistake with clinical precision. A Zero that tried to dogfight with the Hellcat found itself caught in a scissors maneuver, bleeding energy with each turn until the American fighter could extend away or line up for a killing shot. A Judy dive bomber that attempted to attack a carrier ran a gauntlet of fighter attacks, each pass stripping away pieces of the aircraft, an aileron, part of the tail, pieces of the engine cowling, until it fell apart in midair or simply caught fire and tumbled into the sea. By Ron's p.m., the second wave had been annihilated. 97 Japanese aircraft had been shot down. A few survivors fled westward, damaged and low on fuel, heading back toward their carriers or the airfields on Guam. The American fighters, their ammunition depleted, returned to their carriers to rearm and refuel. The flight decks were scenes of organized chaos, aircraft landing, taxiing, being struck below to the hangar decks where armament crews reloaded guns and fuel handlers topped off tanks. Pilots climbed from their cockpits drenched in sweat, their hands shaking from adrenaline, their mouths dry from breathing oxygen for hours. They reported their kills to intelligence officers who could barely keep up with the tally. Some pilots had shot down 3 aircraft, some 4, a few as many as 5 or 6 in a single mission. The numbers seemed impossible, but the gun camera footage proved them accurate. Japanese aircraft falling in flames, exploding in midair, spinning out of control into the sea. The third and fourth Japanese waves arrived in the afternoon, smaller groups that had become disorganized during the long flight from their carriers. By this time, American fighter directors had refined their tactics even further, positioning Hellcats at multiple altitudes to ensure no Japanese aircraft could approach the carriers without being intercepted. The Japanese pilots, exhausted and demoralized by the losses they had witnessed, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed. Some attempted kamikaze attacks, deliberately crashing their damaged aircraft into American ships, even though organized kamikaze tactics would not be formally adopted for several more months. Others simply tried to survive long enough to return to their carriers, nursing damaged engines and hold fuel tanks across miles of open ocean. Few succeeded. The American fighters pursued Japanese aircraft far beyond the normal combat radius, hunting down stragglers and damaged aircraft with merciless efficiency. The ocean surface became littered with wreckage, oil slicks, floating debris, bodies in flight suits that would never be recovered. While the air battle raged over the American carriers, Japanese land-based aircraft on Guam attempted to join the attack, launching multiple strikes throughout the day. These aircraft fared no better than their carrier-based counterparts. American Hellcats from escort carriers dedicated to air defense over the invasion beaches intercepted the land-based strikes, shooting them down in nearly identical kill ratios. On Guam itself, American carrier aircraft struck Japanese airfields repeatedly, catching aircraft on the ground, cratering runways, destroying fuel and ammunition dumps. The Japanese had planned for their land-based aviation to coordinate with the carrier strikes, to create an overwhelming combined assault that would saturate American defenses. Instead, the land-based forces were isolated and destroyed piecemeal, their contribution to the battle measured in dozens of additional aircraft lost for no meaningful result. By nightfall on June 19th, the butcher's bill was catastrophic. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost approximately 375 aircraft in a single day, shot down by fighters, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, lost to operational accidents and fuel exhaustion. American losses totaled 30 aircraft, most to anti-aircraft fire from their own ships, and only a handful of pilots killed. The kill ratio exceeded 12-1, a disparity so extreme that American pilots initially struggled to believe their own reports. But the evidence was undeniable. The radar plots showed Japanese formations disappearing from the screen. The gun camera footage showed aircraft after aircraft falling in flames. The flight decks of Japanese carriers, photographed by American reconnaissance aircraft in the following days, stood empty, the hangars depleted, the air groups effectively annihilated. Admiral Ozawa, receiving reports of the disaster from the few surviving pilots, initially refused to believe the scale of the losses. Japanese military culture did not encourage accurate reporting of defeats. Pilots exaggerated their success and minimized their failures. Commanders inflated damage claims and understated their own losses. But as the afternoon wore on and the strike aircraft failed to return, the truth became inescapable. Operation Ago had failed. The carrier air groups that represented 2 years of rebuilding, that embodied Japan's last hope of achieving a decisive naval victory, had been destroyed in a single day. The carriers remained afloat, the flight decks intact, but they had been transformed into floating coffins. Ships without purpose, platforms without aircraft, symbols of a power that no longer existed. The following day, American carriers launched their own strike against the Japanese fleet, sinking the carrier Hio and damaging several others. More critically, American submarines operating ahead of the fleet had already torpedoed and sunk the carriers Taiho and Shokaku on June 19th, further decimating Japanese carrier strength. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended with the Imperial Japanese Navy having lost 3 carriers, more than 600 aircraft, and critically, the pilots who could never be replaced. The American invasion of Saipan continued without significant interference from Japanese naval aviation. The island fell in early July, and the strategic consequences rippled outward like shock waves from an earthquake. The pilots who survived the turkey shoot, both American victors and the handful of Japanese who managed to escape, carried with them memories that would never fade. American pilots spoke of it in tones that mixed pride with something approaching shame, the uncomfortable awareness that they had participated not in a battle between equals, but in an execution. Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu, who shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single mission, described the experience as like shooting ducks in a pond. They didn't know what hit them. The metaphor was not celebratory but melancholy, the reflection of a professional warrior who understood he had been fighting opponents so overmatched that victory brought no honor, only relief at having survived. Other American pilots reported feeling almost sorry for the Japanese aviators, watching them fly in predictable patterns, making textbook errors, dying without ever having a chance to learn from their mistakes. Japanese survivors, the few who managed to return to their carriers or reach land bases, told stories of systematic annihilation, of American fighters appearing from nowhere, of comrades exploding in flames, of the terrible sound of American engines closing in from behind. They described formations dissolving into chaos, of radio channels clogged with panic and contradictory orders, of the sickening realization that nothing they had been taught in training had prepared them for the reality of combat against a technologically superior and tactically proficient enemy. Some pilots refused to fly again, psychological casualties of an experience so traumatic that it broke their will to fight. Others flew subsequent missions with the resignation of men who knew they were already dead, that survival was no longer possible, that their deaths served only to delay the inevitable by hours or days. The strategic impact of the Battle of the Philippine Sea extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. The destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force meant that subsequent American amphibious operations, the invasions of Palayu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, faced minimal air opposition. Japanese carriers, lacking trained air groups, remained in port or operated with skeleton complements, avoiding combat, preserving themselves for a final decisive battle that would never come. The loss of Saipan gave American B-29 bombers bases from which they could strike Japanese cities, beginning the strategic bombing campaign that would culminate in the firebombing of Tokyo and ultimately the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The turkey shoot demonstrated to Japanese military leadership that conventional defense of the home islands was impossible, that American material superiority had reached levels that courage and sacrifice could not overcome, setting the stage for the kamikaze tactics that would characterize the final year of the Pacific War. A transition from combat aviation to ritual suicide, from fighting to win to fighting simply to die with honor. The symbolic sound of American radial engines that had terrorized Japanese pilots during the battle became, in the months that followed, an acoustic signature of impending doom that haunted the entire Japanese military. Soldiers on Pacific Islands heard those engines in the minutes before American fighters strafed their positions. Sailors on transport ships heard them before rockets and bombs tore their vessels apart. Civilians in Japanese cities would soon hear similar engines, the distinctive note of the Wright R-3350 radial in the B-29 Superfortress, droning overhead in the darkness before incendiary bombs transformed urban neighborhoods into infernos. The sound represented more than military superiority. It embodied industrial capacity, technological advancement, and a fundamental philosophical difference in how the two nations approached warfare. Japan had built an air force based on individual skill, warrior spirit, and aircraft designed to maximize performance through weight reduction and mechanical efficiency. America had built an air force based on systematic training, overwhelming numbers, and aircraft designed to protect pilots and maximize firepower regardless of weight penalties. One philosophy valued the warrior, the other valued the system. In total war, the system won. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of air combat in the industrial age. Skill mattered, certainly. Ace pilots achieved results that average pilots could not, but training and technology mattered more. A mediocre pilot in a Hellcat, supported by radar and radio direction, protected by armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, armed with 6 .50 caliber machine guns, would defeat a skilled pilot in a zero almost every time. The romantic notion of aerial combat as a test of individual prowess, as a modern equivalent of single combat between knights, dissolved in the face of systematic slaughter enabled by technological superiority. Japanese military culture, steeped in the traditions of Bushido and the samurai code, struggled to accept this reality. They continued to emphasize fighting spirit and tactical skill even as their pilots died in numbers that made victory impossible. American military culture, pragmatic and engineering-focused, accepted that war was a problem to be solved through superior resources and systematic application of force. The turkey shoot was the inevitable result of those conflicting philosophies meeting in combat. In the aftermath of the battle, American intelligence officers interrogated captured Japanese pilots and examined recovered documents, piecing together the full extent of the disaster from the Japanese perspective. What they discovered was sobering. The pilots they had been shooting down were not the veterans of Pearl Harbor and the East Indies campaign, but teenagers with barely 2 months of training, sent into combat with aircraft that were obsolete and tactics that were suicidal. The Japanese training pipeline had collapsed under the demands of a protracted war, unable to produce pilots in sufficient numbers or quality to replace losses. Fuel shortages meant that even the reduced training program could not provide adequate flight hours. Experienced instructors had been pulled back to frontline units, replaced by less capable teachers who themselves had minimal experience. The entire system was in a death spiral, each generation of pilots less capable than the previous, losses accelerating as quality declined until the catastrophe of June 19, 1944 became not an aberration, but an inevitable conclusion. The American pilots who participated in the turkey shoot returned home as heroes, their faces appearing in newsreels and magazines, their stories told and retold in bond rallies and recruitment drives. But many of them carried a complicated relationship with their victory. They had done their duty, had fought with skill and courage, had achieved results that would have seemed impossible to the previous generation of aviators. Yet there was something unsatisfying about it, something that felt less like victory and more like murder. The Japanese pilots they shot down had been so overmatched, so inadequately prepared, that killing them felt less like combat than execution. This psychological dissonance, the gap between the heroic narrative of aerial combat and the grinding reality of technological slaughter, would haunt some veterans for the rest of their lives. War had become industrialized, systematized, reduced to mathematics of training hours and production numbers and kill ratios. Individual courage and skill still mattered, but they mattered less than logistics and engineering and organizational capacity. The 3 days of battle over the Philippine Sea in June 1944 cost Japan more than 600 aircraft and the majority of their remaining trained naval aviators. The Imperial Japanese Navy would sortie its carriers one more time at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, where they would serve as decoys, empty holes meant to draw American forces away from the main battle. Their sacrifice, admission that they no longer had the aircraft or pilots to fight effectively. The Japanese naval aviation that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, that had been regarded as the finest in the world, ceased to exist as a combat-effective force on June 19, 1944. What followed was dénouement, the slow collapse of a military machine that had lost the capacity to replace its losses, fighting with courage and desperation, but without hope of victory. The legacy of the turkey shoot extended far beyond World War II. It established principles of naval aviation doctrine that persisted into the jet age. The importance of radar and fighter direction, the value of technological superiority over numerical parity, the need for systematic training pipelines that could produce competent pilots in large numbers. It demonstrated that air superiority, once achieved, could be maintained and exploited to enable naval operations that would otherwise be impossible. It proved that carrier-based air power, properly organized and equipped, could dominate vast expanses of ocean, could suppress enemy aviation, could support amphibious operations, could project power hundreds of miles from the fleet. These lessons informed American naval doctrine through the Cold War and into the present day, shaping carrier design, aircraft procurement, training requirements, and tactical employment. But beneath these strategic and tactical lessons lay a more profound truth about the nature of modern warfare, that industrial capacity and systematic organization would defeat courage and skill when the disparity in resources became too great. Japan in 1944 still possessed brave pilots willing to die for their emperor. It still had engineers capable of designing effective aircraft. It still had a military tradition that emphasized honor, duty, and sacrifice. What it lacked was the industrial base to produce sufficient aircraft, the fuel to train pilots adequately, the time to rebuild what had been lost, and, most critically, the strategic depth to absorb losses and reconstitute forces. America possessed all of these things in abundance. The turkey shoot was not won on June 19, 1944. It was won in the factories of Detroit and Seattle and Los Angeles, in the training bases scattered across the American South and West, in the oil fields of Texas and California, in the organizational capacity of a nation that could devote enormous resources to war while maintaining a civilian economy that actually improved during the conflict. The sound of American radial engines, that symbolic auditory signature of the turkey shoot, faded from the Pacific skies as the war ended, and the surviving aircraft were scrapped or relegated to museums. But the lesson it represented, that freedom and democracy, when threatened, could mobilize resources and organize systems that totalitarian societies could not match, echoed through the decades that followed. The young Japanese pilots who died over the Philippine Sea believed they were fighting for their emperor, for their nation, for values they held sacred. The young American pilots who shot them down believed they were fighting for freedom, for democracy, for the right of nations to determine their own destiny. Both groups were brave. Both groups were sincere. But only one side had the industrial capacity, the technological superiority, and the systematic organization to transform courage into victory. The turkey shoot was not a triumph of virtue over evil. It was a demonstration that in modern warfare, resources matter more than spirit, systems matter more than courage, and the side that can train more pilots, build more aircraft, and learn faster from its mistakes will prevail regardless of individual valor. In the end, the Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as a monument to the transformation of warfare in the industrial age, a marker of the moment when aerial combat ceased to be a contest between individual warriors and became instead a systematic application of industrial power. The 600 Japanese aircraft that fell from the sky in 3 days were flown by men who deserved better. Better training, better equipment, better leadership, better odds. They were sacrificed to a strategic situation that was already lost, sent to die in a battle they could not win, their courage and sacrifice achieving nothing but a slight delay in the inevitable. The American pilots who shot them down were products of a system that valued their lives, that gave them the best equipment available, that trained them thoroughly and supported them completely. The contrast between these two approaches, one that treated pilots as expendable components in a glorious sacrifice, one that treated pilots as valuable assets to be protected and supported, defined the outcome of the Pacific Air War. And in that contrast lies the enduring lesson of the turkey shoot, that freedom, when properly organized and adequately resourced, produces systems that protect individuals, value human life, and ultimately prove more effective than ideologies that demand sacrifice without providing the means for success. The young men who died over the Philippine Sea deserved a system that gave them a chance to survive, and they died because their nation's ideology prioritized glory over effectiveness, spirit over preparation, honor over reality. That is the tragedy beneath the triumph, the melancholy truth beneath the victory, the lesson that echoes across the decades from those 3 days in June when the sky became a slaughterhouse and the sound of American engines became the voice of industrial democracy, asserting its dominance over a warrior culture that had confused courage with capability.